Good morning. Thank you all for coming. So we're going to have a discussion now on the issue of how do Mexico, Cuba, and the United States work together for ensuring the long-term future of the Gulf of Mexico. This panel is a little bit different than most of the panels that have occurred for this conference up to this point, in that all the panelists are in agreement that the concept we're talking about is really a good idea. And the basic theme that we're going to explore is how to establish a unified conservation and management program for the marine protected areas for those three countries in the Gulf. What's also a little different about this panel is, though, that although all the panelists, and I think all of the stakeholders who are involved in this issue are in agreement that this is a good idea, is that two of the principal players are not at the table. That's the U.S. government, and that's really a factor of the politics that are being driven by the current administration. And largely in response to the United States government position, the government of Cuba. So from our panelists, we'll hear a little bit more about that dynamic and what that political dimension means for accomplishing an environmental objective that has tremendous potential benefit for the Gulf of Mexico, environmentally, economically, and socially. So I'm going to start the presentation with a quick overview of this issue. And because this is Jean-Michel Cousteau week at the Tulane Law School, he's about to get on a plane in about a half hour, or has to leave for a plane in about a half hour. We've got a video that was prepared for a conference that I participated in Havana last July that was sponsored by the Cuban government, and that occurred really before the political tension that currently exists between the two countries had arisen. That conference was really amazing for me to participate in because it was huge. There were probably 2,000 people there. And on this issue, there was tremendous excitement about the potential for expanding the relationship between the three countries politically and using this issue as a driver. Since then, a lot of that has fallen apart. But this video that I'm about to show gives you a quick overview of the issue. I presented this at that conference. Using this video did a lot to continue to stimulate that interest and promote the development of additional discussions among the stakeholders involved in the Gulf of Mexico about how we can pursue this common end result. The other theme that will be part of this panel, and I'll be interested to see where it ends up, is I think that this issue has tremendous potential going forward, notwithstanding the current political situation. And what that will really depend upon is how the NGO community steps up to the plate, and this happens often on environmental issues, to take a very important concept, keep it alive, define what's necessary to move forward to achieve a successful end result, and then keeps the progress going forward to a point where hopefully someday there will be a political situation that allows this to really come back in the form of a meaningful and long-term agreement. Before I show the video and give the quick overview, I want to introduce the speakers. Our first speaker will be Maria Jose Espinosa Carrillo. She is the Director of Programs and Operations for the Center for Democracy in the Americas, based in Washington, D.C., which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization founded in 2006. And it focuses on promoting a U.S. policy toward Cuba that is based on engagement and recognition of Cuba's sovereignty And in that position, she provides strategic and operational leadership for CDA's programs on the environment, economic development, and equality. Maria will be followed by Valerie Miller, who is the manager of the Environmental Defense Fund's Cuba Ocean Program, where she manages a multinational interdisciplinary team to develop fisheries management and marine conservation projects in Cuba that connect the fishing industry, coastal communities, scientists, and government leaders for issues arising throughout the Gulf of Mexico and greater Caribbean area. After Valerie, we'll hear from Alejandra Navarrete. She is currently a consultant on the Gulf of Mexico MPA issue for the Ocean Foundation, and she has served as National Project Coordinator for Global Environment Facility Projects for the Mexican government for the Gulf of Mexico Large Marine Ecosystem. I also want to thank very much Jill Hamilton, who is getting her master's degree at the Nichols School for the Environment at Duke, for helping coordinate all this. Jill has worked extensively on Gulf issues and has played a tremendous role in pulling this program together and participating in the MPA issue in the Gulf. I also want to mention that the Tulane Law School has always been very active on Cuba environment issues and continues to be a leader. So thank you for doing that. Is anybody from the Environmental Law Journal here? Okay, well, I think the next edition of the Tulane Environmental Law Journal will have an article on this issue authored by me, Dr. Heather Rowley, who spoke yesterday on the animal welfare panel. Heather has a lot of experience in the Gulf of Mexico, having been down here for a year after the spill, working with coastal communities on social and environmental issues, and also has a lot of expertise on coral. Our article really focuses on the potential for this type of an agreement to produce long-term benefits for the conservation and recovery of coral throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot going on this issue, and we view this panel as sort of a stepping stone to what's going to follow for future discussions, and we'll talk about that.
Don?
Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but as you know, I have to go on my way to the Philippines, where I'm going to try to help the people over there. But I want to thank you. It's because of Don Bauer that I come to these presentations in this beautiful part of the United States. And I want to thank you, Don. And I wish I could be there for the whole program because, of course, being French, I was diving in Cuba when Americans were not allowed there. And it's an absolutely beautiful place when it comes to the ocean. And so I hope you're going to enjoy that. I'd like to learn a lot more from you. But unfortunately, I have to go and catch a plane. So thank you, Don.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. So you can listen to yourself for the next 4 minutes, and then you can.
I've had the privilege of visiting some of the most spectacular places in the Gulf of Mexico, with my father aboard Calypso and with my team of explorers as we filmed for our TV program, Ocean Adventures. The Gulf is rich with unique and diverse ocean life and environments, and each of the countries that help manage the Gulf is working to protect the special places in their waters. Cuba has some of the healthiest coral reefs in the Gulf and in all of the Caribbean. My father worked closely with President Castro during the 1985 filming of our TV special, Cuba Waters of Destiny. Mexico protects several Gulf of Mexico jewels in national parks and biosphere reserves. And the U.S. protects and sustainably manages unique locations through national marine sanctuaries, national parks, and conservation areas. The Gulf has large industries such as oil and gas, shipping, fishing, and tourism that create millions of jobs. And these industries cooperate with ocean conservation efforts so that each can thrive adjacent to the other. There are many good things to celebrate in the Gulf of Mexico. However, we can create a stronger system of stewardship where each of the marine and national parks collaborate with each other, sharing information and strategies so that the Gulf is managed as an ecosystem. Science has shown us that everything is connected. This system of ecosystem connections is the basis for how Cuba, Mexico, and the United States are proposing to work together to protect what we share in the Gulf of Mexico. They call it the Gulf of Mexico Sister Sanctuary Network. The Sister Sanctuary Network will facilitate the sharing of science and understanding so managers can better prepare for and respond to the changes and threats that the region will face in the future, particularly due to climate change and from potential effects that increased tourism to Cuba could have on its coral reefs, whose continued health is vital to the entire Gulf. There should be no resistance to creating the Sister Sanctuary Network since it does not impose any closures or restrictions on commerce and industry. It is a way to work smarter and together for the health of our shared ocean planet, our life support system. My father used to say to me, people protect what they love. And I would reply, how can we protect what we don't understand? Creating a sister sanctuary network will help us work across borders as partners to manage and protect the Gulf of Mexico as a magnificent ocean ecosystem.
Just to set the stage a little bit more, and that's a great overview of the issue. Keep in mind that was first presented on the 4th of July last year in Havana. At the end of the Obama administration, the United States government, through NOAA, entered into a precedent-setting agreement with Cuba that focused on the sister sanctuaries between the two countries. That agreement was really the opening initiative in what was expected to be a continued gradual expansion of relationships between the United States and Cuba. It was very interesting that the environment was the place that was chosen for the initial agreement to build a new relationship between the two countries. That agreement then led to a second agreement that focused on bringing the U.S. national parks into the equation, as well as the Cuban national parks. Those two agreements have been going through, and this is sort of beneath the surface. It's something that there has been a very strong effort to avoid making it a political issue. But those two agreements are moving forward through an implementation stage through the development of a work plan between the two countries. At the same time, Cuba has been engaged in discussions with Mexico about a similar agreement. That basic agreement is in place. Alejandro will talk a little bit about this. and is also getting into an implementation stage, and Mexico and the United States are talking about an agreement. So you've got three separate pieces here, which establish a foundation for hopefully bringing it all together. So that's where we are today. Our panelists will help us explore where we can go next. Maria?
Thank you, Don. Hi. So I'm going to spend around 10 minutes giving an overview on U.S.-Cuba relations and what the current status is. And I'm going to also give an update on Cuba's economic transition and political transition and how this is affecting and will affect joint environmental cooperation between our countries and with Mexico in the long term. As we all know, the U.S.-Cuba relationship has been plagued with untrust and antagonism. But since 1960, our scientific communities have been cooperating, and NGOs and government officials have made sure that we can cooperate in different areas of interest. It was on December 17, 2014, when President Obama and President Raul Castro announced that they will restore full diplomatic ties between the two countries. And of course, this led to significant improvements in the relationship between the two countries after 1960. This picture shows President Obama walking the streets of Old Havana in March 2016, and it was the first sitting U.S. president in visiting the island in 88 years. So his words and his visit to Cuba were met with optimism among the Cuban people as a pathway for normalization. So there were a lot of measures that were taken at the moment, and I'm going to mention a few of them here in my presentation. And as a result of the changing relationship, a bilateral commission was created between the two countries, and there were 22 bilateral agreements signed, and of those, 9 were related to scientific and environmental cooperation, including the ones that Don just mentioned. At the same time, and in order to keep promoting the conversations, the U.S. Treasury and Commerce departments implemented 5 rounds of regulatory reforms, including, and that was the most important, loosening restrictions on travel and trade, and also a lot of reforms and efforts to facilitate scientific cooperation. The Obama administration at the moment also recognized the importance of philanthropy and NGOs in these issues, and of course that's going to be very important in the current situation in the Cuba-U.S. relations. So this is just an example of the impact that this moment had in the Cuba's economy. Here in the chart, you can see the increase in the U.S. Travel to Cuba from 2010 to 2016. And recent figures are showing that in 2017 only, 620,000 Americans or U.S. citizens traveled to the island. That was just last year. And the total number of visitors was 4.7 tourists last year. So this was, I think, one of the main impacts of the reestablishing of the relationship between the two countries. And then things change again. The election of Donald Trump posed new questions on the U.S. policy toward Cuba, and on his visit to Miami in June 2017, he stated that he would reinstate some restrictions on travel and trade. And as a result of that, he issued a national security presidential memorandum where he told the U.S. Department of Commerce, Treasury, and the State Department to review the U.S. policy toward Cuba. So it was in November 2017 that the Treasury, Commerce, and State issued a new policy toward Cuba. that didn't change everything with respect to the Obama policy, but a few things that I want to present here today. So what are the key changes of the National Security Presidential Memorandum? First, prohibition on individual people-to-people travel to Cuba. This means that Americans who visit the island only can go there with groups and a travel agency, and they need a sponsor to be with them on the island, which is, of course, affecting a little bit the travel of U.S. citizens to Cuba. Second, a prohibition on direct financial transactions between Cuba's military, intelligence, or security services. And this includes GAESA, which is the military conglomerate that it's working heavily in tourism in Cuba. They published a list of 180 entities which with transaction are prohibited. And you can go online and see the list at the U.S. State Department website. And then third, an expanded list of Cuban prohibited officials who cannot travel to or receive funds from the United States, which is also affecting, of course, bilateral cooperation. Last, a streamlined definition of allowable exports to Cuba's private sector, which was the least complicated of the measures. Then, what doesn't change with the NSPM? First, diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba will continue, and so far we have embassies in both countries. Existing cooperation agreements that we mentioned before will remain in effect, and the U.S. and Cuba are expected to continue the dialogues. We will see in a few minutes what is affecting this right now. Also, regulations allowing unlimited remittances to Cuba didn't change, but this not include the prohibited officials that I mentioned before. And lastly, U.S. companies with existing commercial agreements in Cuba are exempt from the State Department's November restrictions. That includes Starwood, Marriott, and Caterpillar. Then I'm pretty sure, and to further complicating things, I'm pretty sure you have heard about the mysterious health incidents that happened in Cuba in 2016. And as a result of this, the U.S. State Department withdrew 60% of the staff in September 2017, 60% of the staff at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, and requested an equal number of Cuban diplomats to leave the U.S. Just a week ago, the State Department made the staffing movement permanent, so now the embassy is operating as an accompanied post. This means that the diplomats serve abroad without their families. They cannot go to the country with their families. The ordered departure issue a concurrent Cuba travel warning of the Department of State to the general public, telling the public not to go to Cuba. And they have, you can see there are different levels in the safety ranking, and right now Cuba is number 3, which means that the State Department is telling the U.S. citizen not to travel to Cuba. And under this warning, U.S. officials are not allowed to travel to Cuba either. So this will affect bilateral cooperation as well. We believe that this skeletal diplomatic presence in Havana will have a significant impact on U.S. diplomacy, on Cuban migration, and on the Cuban people, because right now there are no consulate services in the embassy in Havana, and Cuba have to use a third country to request visas, to do interviews, and that includes Cuban officials and people working on environmental issues. The Cuban government, on the other hand, had told the American government not to cut the diplomatic ties, and they said they didn't know what was happening, and of course denied the involvement in any of these issues. And if you go online, you will see a lot of articles and speculation around these attacks that were first called sonic attacks and then health issues. So it's a complicated moment right now. So I know I've covered a lot here, but as all this is happening in Cuba, there is an important political and economic transition happening at the same time. So in April 19, 2018, President Raúl Castro will step down, and this is a historical moment where the economic policy, the international relations, the cultural and demographic trends in Cuba are all shifting. And I will give you some highlights, and we can we can have some questions at the Q&A. But on the political transition, it's important to say that in April, the Cuba's National Assembly, which is the Cuban's parliament, is going to elect the president, vice president, and the Council of State. And this is an unprecedented moment in the Cuba's history. And while Raúl Castro will no longer be the president, fulfilling a promise that he made in 2013, he will remain as the first secretary of the Communist Party, likely until 2021. And he will also be an elected official at the National Assembly. According to the Cuban Constitution, the next president should be the current vice president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. And this is interesting. Miguel Díaz-Canel is 57 years old, and he's younger than Cuba's traditional leaders. So his rights to leadership will mark a break with the previous generation, all generations, and his success will be linked to the capacity he will have to move with this economic transition and with all the changes. Before older generations, their legitimacy was linked in part to their relationship with Raúl and Fidel and their participation in the Cuban Revolution. This case is totally new for Cuba. And of course, the new leader and the new team will face an enormous set of complex issues, being the number one, the economy, and the unification of the dual currency system in Cuba, and within the political elite in Cuba, there is also a debate about the depth and pace of the economic transition. So this new leader and the leadership team will have a lot to cover after April. And something that's also super important and related, as I mentioned, is the updating of the Cuban economic model. Since 2008, Cuba is going an economic transition, and they are updating, and that's how it's referred to, updating the socialist economic model. And as I say, there are many difficult updates on the horizon, being one, the unification of the currency. And some experts know that the government is hesitant to keep going with this economic update up until, with this political transition as well, there might be negative effect on the society and on the stability on the island. So we don't know the pace or the depth right now, but it's happening. The transition is happening. On foreign relations, countries around the globe are seeking commercial opportunities with Cuba, are closing in diplomatic ties, and the U.S., which is a natural partner with Cuba, is walking away from this situation. So what does all this mean? First, the ability of the United States to understand changes underway on the island depends on their capacity and the capacity of the embassy in Havana. And the U.S. diminished diplomatic position in Cuba will have long-lasting consequences on and policy implications, of course. And we see that this will affect bilateral cooperation in two ways. First, direct. And I have some points here. It's important to know that the bilateral agreements continue. The National Security Presidential Memorandum states that the bilateral cooperation continues. But having no consular services in Havana is, of course, affecting bilateral cooperation because it's impossible for Cuban officials to travel to Cuba without going through a third country. So that's one of the main effects that this whole situation is having on cooperation. And it's important also to say that non-governmental groups are helping to keep these agreements going forward. And for example, Mexico will serve as a third country where the conversations might keep happening. And of course, the constrained ability to cooperate in issues of common interest will affect societies, as we of course know. And then indirect impact. First, this increased hostility is damaging the Cuban economy and the life of average Cubans on the island, because as you saw, tourism is having a very big impact on the Cuba's economy, and we can talk about that later. It reinforces anti-reform elements within the Cuban government, people that don't want this change to happen. So with this hostility, there are some elements within the government saying, well, now we have to be careful. And that might affect, of course, bilateral cooperation. It's creating a reaction in Cuba. And of course, it hurts the prospect for a stable transition on the island, which is going to affect the leadership and the legitimacy of the president. And at the end, when you can build a consensus around economic and political reforms, and when the economy is in trouble, we all know that the environmental issues become secondary. Thank you.
There we go. Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much to Tulane Law School and to Dawn for including me in this panel, and it's just a real honor to sit with all of you on this collaboration and to hear from everyone in the audience later on in the discussion. So thank you. So I'm going to build on the introduction that Dawn gave on the connectedness between the three countries and the current situation that was just described between the Cuban and U.S. administrations, and try to answer from an environmental NGO perspective, why should these three countries collaborate on marine protected areas? I'm currently working with Environmental Defense Fund, and our organization's Oceans program works in 14 geographies around the world to work with partners to make fisheries more sustainable for healthy ecosystems and healthy and prosperous communities. We have currently programs and long-standing programs working in the U.S. Gulf, in Mexico on both coasts, and a team that I'm a part of based in the U.S. but supporting projects with the Cuban government and shared priorities in Cuba. So I think we're in a good position to continue to bring partners together. Maybe. There we go. So why should we collaborate? Well, I think this perspective makes it pretty obvious. We all share one ocean, and you don't see borders here. And so this is really framing the whole reason of why we have to work together. And that, of course, is that we have shared ecosystems. And these shared ecosystems provide many services and economic benefits and mitigate impacts of climate change, and are really what's holding this work together. So from mangrove systems to coral reefs to coastal sand dunes to seagrass ecosystems, there's connectedness across countries, across the region, and representative ecosystems that you can find in all three countries. And that means we also share species, in particular highly migratory species like the whale shark. Here on top you can see these curly, colorful lines show the movement patterns of various whale sharks that were tagged off of Mexico and toured the Gulf, and some went down south and some over north of Cuba. But these whale sharks and their movements are not only interesting but critical to better managing a species that's not only majestic but the basis of a large tourism industry across the whole region. And below you can see the longfin mako shark. This is just one route of one individual that was tagged in the upper Gulf and then swam down south across Cuba and then went up the North Atlantic. And this is an example of top predators that you can find across the entire Gulf and Caribbean region and play a really critical role in ecosystem health. So understanding these movements and how these species are shared across the region is another important reason to collaborate. And because we share ecosystems and species, we also share similar economies based on coastal and marine resources. So this is a map that shows with the stars around Cuba different spawning aggregation sites for various snapper species, and then the kind of pink blotches to the south of Florida and the red blotches over here on the Caribbean part of Mexico indicate larval settlement habitat where those species larvae have dispersed after leaving Cuba and help build the commercially important species that we have in the Gulf that we enjoy eating and we enjoy fishing for, and all three countries rely on those key fish resources for food and income and supporting coastal economies. And another reason to collaborate is that the three countries have already taken many actions to protect these ecosystems and resources. So the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba all have protected coastal and marine habitats for migratory species that move from the U.S. to Cuba or U.S. to Mexico, and those include many species of sandpipers and warblers, and also 5 species of sea turtles that navigate the Gulf, and all countries have sites that help protect habitat for sea turtles and value the need to restore those populations. And other species that aren't necessarily migratory or shared, but are represented in different countries include the flamingo. Both Cuba and Mexico have multiple sites that protect flamingo habitat and attract visitors from around the world to see these amazing animals. And all of that protection and action that's already happened has created strong tourism economies based on diving and wildlife watching and fishing and visiting these parks in all of the countries. So besides the connectivity as a reason to continue to collaborate, we also face the same challenges across the region. So those include overfishing, impacts of climate change, including sea level rise and temperature rise. And you can see here in a photo of one of the communities we've been working with for the past few years, Playa Florida, on southern Cuba, where sea level rise has already impacted the town, and they're part of a relocation process and a rebuilding of the community farther inshore to in response to these changes. And of course, the impact of pollution, whether that's runoff from agriculture or plastics, or in the case of the Deepwater Horizon tragedy and environmental disaster, the oil spill, and that played a key wake-up moment in all three countries' environmental sectors when, after the oil spill, in many cases it was difficult to really understand the true impacts because of a lack of baseline data for different resources and ecosystems. So in order to combat these challenges, it's needed that there's collaboration on science to better understand what's happening, to better understand what can happen in the future, and to take actions together. Another reason to support the Sister Sanctuaries system is that we have a strong foundation of collaboration and relationships to build on. In 2007, representatives from the three countries created the Trinational Initiative for Marine Science and Conservation in the Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean. It's a crazy long name, but we just call it the Trinational Initiative. And it's since 2007, partners both from government and non-government institutions have been meeting almost annually and participate in 6 working groups: sharks, sea turtles, marine mammals, fish. I'm missing one. And marine protected areas. So there's already a long-standing working group that's advancing science and collaboration across marine protected areas in the region. And this group has been producing results through new partnerships that are formed and new science that's been created and policies now. And the next Trinational Initiative meeting will be later this April, where we hope to continue this conversation also among government partners. In that case, it'll be hosted in Merida in Mexico. So some of the results that we've seen from these partnerships so far include Cuba's National Plan of Action for Shark Conservation. In 2013, Cuba committed to developing their first plan to protect sharks and the economic benefits that they provide, and asked us at EDF to bring on expertise from the U.S. and Mexico, who had already had shark plans, to guide the process. So over 2 years, we worked with partners in the 3 countries to do outreach and compile data and help produce this plan that Cuba published in 2015 and is recognized as a decree law that gives it legal backing for the implementation of the actions that are required in the plan. And you can see below that the collaboration is growing. This photo includes people from all 3 countries that had worked together on this during the 2 years of development and now these last 2 years of implementation. And it continues to grow. During our recent work through projects in Cuba working on community-based fisheries and marine conservation, we were able to bring partners together and have exchanges to share lessons learned and experiences on MPAs and fisheries in the U.S., in Mexico, and these exchanges involved U.S. government representatives from NOAA, Cuban government representatives that are fishery managers, as well as fishers themselves and scientists, and protected area staff. So even if the governments aren't necessarily always on the same page and hosting their own government-to-government relations, we've been able to bring people together over the years. And I think the exchange in Quintana Roo was particularly special because the group from Cuba that traveled to the Siancan Biosphere Reserve was able to see firsthand a lot of success on the ground in Mexico of communities working with protected area managers to fish sustainably, to protect habitat, and to benefit from the region. And I think those lessons continue to apply in the work in Cuba, and the project on the ground resulted in a new marine protected area in 2016 and new management plans for 2 marine protected areas in Cuba based on these lessons learned and methods and strategies shared across the 3 countries. Our team in Mexico as well is working more closely with fishing cooperatives and scientists in the Gulf of Mexico. And just last year they hosted this exchange in Campeche and brought a fisher down from Florida to also share their stories and learn from each other. So the group is getting larger and larger, and there's support from all sides. And just this last month, we returned from a 2-week university course in Havana on sustainable fisheries management that was taught by U.S., Cuban, and Mexican experts in fisheries and marine conservation. 30 current professionals from Cuba, from the fishing industry, from protected areas, people that work in ecotourism, all were a part of this course and worked together to develop and draft sustainable fisheries management plans. So it's happening, and you might not know it, but the 3 countries continue to work together. And beyond the work that I'm involved with, there's a lot of great results coming directly from the agreements that were described on the sister sanctuaries and the environmental accord that were signed under the Obama administration and remain in place. So just last summer, the U.S. government and the Cuban government had a joint expedition called Cuba's Twilight Zone Reefs and their Regional Connectivity. This expedition circumnavigated the island and explored deep water coral reefs for the first time and made incredible discoveries about coral species, sponges, and the overall health of these ecosystems that was not known previously, and will be able to really provide a baseline that's needed into the future to protect the region. You can see here's the crew, and the results are still coming out from this expedition, but if you look up that expedition online, they have a whole series of blogs and great photos and stories of the collaboration. And the government-to-government talks, while they are more difficult now and face the challenges that Maria described, they're still happening. And this week, there were meetings in Florida on the oil and gas agreements between Cuba and U.S. and sister sanctuaries. There was a day of non-governmental meetings where participants from NGOs and government representatives or scientists from Cuba participated, and then were followed by government-to-government talks. Our program worked to facilitate the visa of a Cuban official to the Florida talks, and so we're working hard to try to find exceptions, and it might be difficult, but we're still working at it. So through all this work, our partners tend to come to us with lots of different questions, and we come back to them with many questions in our work. And I think a sister sanctuaries system between the three countries can continue to help us answer these questions and share information. Questions like, why are Cuba's coral reefs more resilient to bleaching? They're the healthiest in the region. I think Mexico and the U.S. have a lot to learn. I know our partners in Cuba have asked many times to learn about how communities in Mexico have benefited from MPAs and the successful work that Mexico has led. We've also gotten questions about how did the U.S. recover depleted fish populations in different parts of the country, and how can those lessons be shared? What can data from MPAs tell us about the health of our ecosystems currently and our fisheries? And how do we measure the economic benefits of conservation to strengthen the arguments for continued protection? So I think a sister sanctuary system could have many, many potential benefits for the region. And here's just a few to summarize. One of them is that this type of agreement can really serve as a formal vehicle to coordinate efforts to collect baseline data. All three countries are interested in taking action on creating or collecting more baseline data so that if another disaster happens, they know what the current status is of resources. But having a formal way to coordinate that collection, to collect the same information, to share it, would just make more sense and create better results. It also help us improve our understanding of connectivity across the region, and if there are gaps in the current efforts that the three countries are taking in management and conservation. It would also allow us to exchange best local practices, what's working in each place within MPAs to manage, to enforce, to involve communities, and how can those be applied and adapted to the other countries. And I think even most critically, the three countries could then implement coordinated regional conservation and management actions. I think the partners that we've worked with share the same objectives, but haven't necessarily been able to implement these larger coordinated actions because there isn't this formal agreement. And it would allow all countries to support sustainable businesses that are connected to MPAs, whether it's through ecotourism or certain types of mariculture and different projects that are already existing and could be strengthened by greater collaboration. And lastly, I think it's an opportunity to continue to strengthen a tri-national team of marine conservation leaders across the region and provide opportunities for the next generation that are coming up and are communicating more and are taking advantage of changes in technology and in their ability to reach out across the different countries and and create new objectives and new partnerships. So I wanted to share this photo, which I took outside of the announcement in Havana of the Sister Sanctuaries Agreement a few years ago. It was a really special day, and this Sister Sanctuaries Agreement and the Environmental Accord were two of the first three agreements that were made between the U.S. and Cuba, the third one being Postal Service agreements. So it was the environment and the Postal Service, and it was a very exciting time. This, as Don mentioned, happened at the kickoff of the opening of relations between the two countries, and we sat there in Old Havana and watched the previous director of NOAA and the director of the Cuban Park Service and representatives from the U.S. Park Service stand together and talk about why their collaboration was important. Those agreements are still in place, and although it did happen with the opening of relations, I think it's important to remember that the work that allowed those agreements to be signed happened years before, when relations were not open, when officials could not always talk to each other, could not visit each other, and the commitment of the three countries, and in this case particularly the U.S. and Cuba, to try to find common ground and to slowly build the relationships and draft these agreements and just wait for the right timing was critical. And when the time came, we were ready. And a lot of that work happened behind the scenes between key government partners and NGOs helping facilitate and build those bridges. So we're back again now with a more difficult situation, and the changes of the Trump administration and the limited staff at the embassy and the visa services are already creating barriers to the government-to-government collaboration. But I think we've been in this place before, and we're going to continue to work hard to bring partners together. It's not going to be easy, but it ain't over. And NGOs like EDF and our other partners are going to continue to bring the countries together, and we'll be ready when there's the chance to advance this work. So thank you very much.
In the folder?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. I want to thank Don for putting this together, and thank Jill and Valerie and Maria, because we tried to make an effort to get this panel together. I'm Alejandra Navarrete. Right now I'm switching caps. I was with a project of the United Nations, the Jeff Project, and last week, in December there was a change, and the Mexican government is switching UN agencies, so we're going to have a gap. So it would be very important that the work that the NGOs are doing and all the people around the project that would keep this work going. I'm going to present you first a little bit of how the legal system works for the MPAs in Mexico, and then I'll present you the project, and then we'll have a wrap-up of the work we're going to keep on going with this. MPAs in the Mexican legal system are done by presidential decrees, that's executive order. They have a very long-standing tradition of protected areas. There are the very different types of protected areas, and in 1996 there was a big reform of the environmental laws, and the laws established that only you could have national parks in the marine areas. Uh, this is important because, ¿cómo paso las? Okay. The work we are trying to do between Mexico, U.S., and Cuba is establishing a network of marine protected areas. So the type of relationship we were building together, most of it was moved forward towards one of the projects of United Nations. This project has a first stage. In this very first stage, the methodology of international waters, you have to do a transboundary diagnostic analysis, and then you have to do a strategic action program. So this is the second phase of this project. In the first phase, I'm going to show you what we did in the first phase. Transboundary waters are very important because nearly half of the world's population is located in one of them. More than 265 international drainage basins are shared by 2 or more states. 145 nations possess the territory within international basins. 21 nations lie in the entirety within international basins, and 33 countries have greater than 95% of the territory within international basins. So what Jean-Michel was telling us yesterday, water and oceans are very, very important. So what we have here between U.S., Mexico, and Cuba, we have this large basin. That's the Gulf of Mexico. The way the NOAA proposed a methodology, it's a true ecosystem-based approach. So the Convention on Biodiversity involves 12 principles of ecosystem-based approach, and they have 5 steps. The first step is to do a diagnostic analysis of this, determine who are the main stakeholders, define the ecosystem area, develop a relationship among them, characterize the structure and function of this ecosystem, and set up management and monitoring mechanisms. Identify the economic issues that are important, that affect them, the stakeholders and the ecosystem itself, and the impact of the ecosystem on adjacent ecosystems. So what's going to happen outside the Gulf, all the currents that go to the Caribbean, decide on long-term goals and flexible ways to meet them. So that's what we did in the first step between U.S. and Mexico. We had in 2004, U.S., Mexico, and Cuba applying for the first fund or the first part of the project. 1 week before it was presented to the JEF, Cuba said, no, I don't want to go with you because it's not the political time. So right now, we are in a time that last year, after almost 14 years, Cuba was interested again. And because they had the Obama agreement in 2015, they could put all this together, say, okay, let's forget what happened in the past, let's move on. But now we are again in a critical position. So I think these type of projects would help us move together. In the case of the Gulf of Mexico, the lying diagnostic analysis brought that there are a lot of nutrients in the Gulf of Mexico, which leads to more phytoplankton, so there's more carbon in the bottom, so there's hypoxia, so there's less oxygen. So this is how it looks. So you see the dead part and the live part. So that's what happens in the Mississippi. That's what's happening, so it's bringing all to the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the underlying scientific problem that we're trying to avoid with this type of ecosystem. What is the objective of a large marine ecosystem? You have to bring a regional effort, you have to have the ecosystem-based management, and you have to manage the whole large marine ecosystem. The objective is to reduce pollution, restore habitat, and recuperate living marine resources. This is how the project was structured. From 2009 to 2011, the diagnostic analysis was done, and it involved productivity, fish and fisheries, monitoring of the health of the ecosystem, governance, socioeconomic, and climate change. That translated into a strategic action program, and that program, the 2 governments signed on doing actions on reducing contaminants, recuperating marine living resources, restoring ecosystems, policies to implement and strategies to implement better livelihoods and mitigation and adaptation. From 2012 to 2013, we were supposed to have national action programs. That hasn't taken place. So not Mexico or U.S. have done national action programs. So that this is an opportunity that we could work on. The roots of this strategic action program was a plan of action after the oil spill of BP. There was this Gulf of Mexico program. The 5 states in the United States got together and made an association. So they have the governor's action plan. So this is new plan is plan number 2, is the green one. And then you have the action plan from EPA. Sadly, EPA monitoring and action program from the Gulf of Mexico was closed this year, so we don't have that one anymore. And from Mexico, we have the coastal management plans, and these are the 4 watersheds that go into the Gulf of Mexico: Pánuco, Papaloapan, Coatzacoalcos, and Grijalva, Usumacinta. This is the basis where the project works, and that's the way the project is structured. It's between NOAA and Semarnat. There are 8 executing agencies from the Mexican government, because JEF projects can only go to Mexico because U.S. is a big donor. So the first component has to do with improving water quality. The second component has to do with fish and fisheries. We're doing a stock assessment between Mexico, between U.S. and NOAA on 1 migrating species, and trying to help establish the marine living resources. And the third component has to do with the network of marine protected areas and recovering 3,000 hectares of mangroves and improving the bilateral cooperation between the 2 countries. So the third component, the 3.5, is support the effectiveness of marine protected areas by linking them into networks. We had a meeting last year, and the objectives and what we brought out of that meeting was that there would be 2 focal points, and the countries will get together to take advantage of the marine sanctuaries condition reports, and that's one of the products that we will have. The first meeting, I changed things for this, but that's okay. The products of this network would be a report condition system, identify the strengths and weaknesses of marine protected areas, appropriate marine protected areas management, a toolkit for evaluation of the marine protected areas in each of the countries, an atlas showing the habitats and communities, and a trinational agreement. Right now, where we are is we're not going to have a trinational agreement. What we're going to have is agreement between Mexico and Cuba for a program, and between Mexico and U.S. through NOAA for a program. So Mexico would be pivotal between the 2 countries. And that this is one of the things we want to do, to have condition reports for each of them. And this is where the project is. And the importance of working now is the project would be closed for a couple of months, but we're going to keep on working through the NGOs. And I want to show you a video that was sent to us by Cuba Mar, one of the NGOs that works in the trinational, and it would give you a sense of where we are now. ¿Qué hago con esto? Okay? Yes.
So the significance of this workshop is we're doing this against all odds. So the workshop that came together really nicely this week is a workshop about a sister sanctuary that was created through the rapprochement conceived by Presidents Obama and President Castro in 2014. So the first of the agreements was a sister sanctuary program between 2 protected areas in the United States and 2 in Cuba. The idea being to share resources, experiences between these MPAs, create an exchange between the managers.
We've already got an agreement with 2 countries, U.S. and Cuba. Now we need to do everything to collaborate between Cuba and Mexico and the United States and Mexico so that there's a 3-way effort going on here.
Creo que los resultados más importantes va a ser que el gobierno de México y el de Cuba, a través de sus comisiones de áreas naturales protegidas, tengan un programa de trabajo para el hermanamiento de los parques y para la red de áreas marinas protegidas que queremos hacer México, Cuba y Estados Unidos, y que el proyecto GEF de implementación del gran ecosistema realmente empiece a tener vida a través de ellos.
We're looking at a situation in which we can keep going on our commitments to each other to protect and conserve shared natural resources and shared species.
Este convenio que se ha estado haciendo entre los 3 países ha sido muy fructífero y pienso que es muy positivo para los 3 países. Hay muchas cosas culturales dentro de las sociedades de los 3 países y de nuestros recursos naturales que son comunes y que nos unen por naturaleza.
With the new administration, this program hasn't moved as fast as we hoped it would. So I made the decision to inject ourselves into this and help where we could in terms of bringing the managers together and giving this a little boost. And it's been a fantastic workshop. We've helped bring everyone together. There have been fantastic conversations.
Estamos en un gran momento, en donde hay una apertura gracias al trabajo que hizo Obama. Nos abrió una puerta muy grande y debemos de tomar esa oportunidad de trabajar juntos los 3 países. De nada. So I think that the video makes a very nice conclusion of where we are now and the efforts we're going to keep going to this. So I leave you the floor, Don.
Right.
And if you want more information of the project, I've got it, so you can take it.
All right. That was a great job. You all did a beautiful job summarizing where this stands. So thank you. Okay, let's have some questions, discussions.
So as far as NGOs being involved in trying to continue this process and continue this collaboration, what are some of the hurdles that you guys think could potentially arise, or is there any kind of pushback from maybe some other organizations that are not for this collaboration? Is there like a general consensus, or, because I mean there is a general consensus I feel, but I'm in the position to believe that because governments usually like to strong-arm certain situations, there may be a potential for there to be some kind of dissonance in this collaborative effort.
I think the current administration, of course, this new policy has had a chilling effect on all the communication and collaboration. But at this point, I think NGOs and non-governmental organizations are really working on keeping these conversations going. And it's the case of EDF, as they mentioned, and all the organizations. Of course, it's going to be more difficult, and for example, there was a chilling effect on businesses and people trying to do business in Cuba, and that was something that we were talking about before. With this administration, that's an argument that you can use if you're interested in doing businesses, because that's their language, and especially being so anti-environment. So you need to find a way to talk to the administration in terms that they can understand. So there's been a chilling effect on businesses, on businesses in Cuba, but on NGOs and environmental work, I think that the effect is the opposite. We're trying to keep the conversations going, and so far I think we have the space to do so.
bring officials from Cuba to the U.S. because of the lack of visa services. And thankfully, the patience and extreme open-mindedness of the Cuban government have not retaliated and have not restricted visas for Americans trying to travel to Cuba. The process that existed before is still the current process with the same regulations, and I think it speaks really highly of the government to remain patient with all the changes that happen and have negative consequences from the U.S. I think the other less clear result is that the level of uncertainty that the changes have caused limits people's willingness to work on the long term. So we have many agreements with partners to implement different activities and take more steps forward for this next year. But partners aren't willing to commit beyond that because who knows what can happen. So, I think we could dream bigger when Obama was advancing the progress, and now we've had to limit those dreams to a shorter time frame.
The questions?
I guess. So this issue seems to really be focused because we're dealing with nations interacting with each other. I'm just wondering, is there a role for the individual private citizen to help promote or push this type of issue, agenda?
I think, I encourage people to learn more about the relations between the three countries, and if you can, following the legal permits, travel to Cuba and tell your friends and colleagues of the positive things happening there, and the perception that Cuba is a safe place to travel, which is considered by polls of U.S. travelers to Cuba to be one of the safest places in the world, and by other tourism industries to be one of the safest places in the world to travel. I think that can, hopefully change perceptions of government officials over time.
I just want to add a personal observation on this point and be interested in your perspective. I've spent only a little time in Cuba. You all have much more experience there. But during the brief period of time that I had there, I really made an effort to take advantage of the individual-to-individual contact. And that was incredible for me, is just to spend time with the Cuban people and talk to them about their history, the U.S. history, what the relationship was between the two countries, what they could stand to gain, and what the U.S. could stand to gain from opening relations. So we talked a little bit about the environmental issues. It was amazing, just the difference in perspective between the people in the two countries, and there's so much that the Cuban people have to learn, as do we, that they just have not had the opportunity to get a perspective on. And if I was a political leader in this country who was really opposed to a political regime in Cuba and wanted to bring about change, I think the one thing I would do is keep those one-to-one relationships going so that the American people can spend time with the Cuban people and just talk about life and what's happening. But for those of you who spend time in Cuba, you see that, is there an opportunity there? Is that a place where, just looking at environmental issues, a message can be conveyed and that progress can be made in political and social terms as well as environmental?
I think, yes. I work in CDA, the organization I work at. That's what we do. We do fact-finding missions to Cuba. We've been doing that for more than 10 years. We've been bringing members of Congress, and that's the strategy that works when you have the people-to-people exchange, and it works both ways. So it's super informative, and to get to know the Cuban people, to get to know what they're doing, what they're working on, and to understand that they are eager to work together with the people of the United States is super important, and for my organization has worked pretty well. And we have gotten support from a lot of members of Congress after a trip to Cuba. And it works the same for the Cuban people there. And when the National Security Presidential Memorandum happened in June 2017, we brought a group of entrepreneurs from Cuba to the Congress, and they wrote a letter of recommendations on policy, saying, please keep the conversation going. We need U.S. tourism, and of course it's a trade-off, and there are a lot of things on the plate, but that's how it works with I think with Cuba-U.S. relations, and the work of individuals, even here in the U.S., in South Florida, working with the local governments, working with the governments in Miami. It's something that is very important at this moment.
I have a question. You talked about there's a lot of collaboration on data. Is there like some tangible, like is there a website you can go to and use their data and like actually see these data, or is there a website I can go to and upload my data? Is that
well, the idea of the project is to have that. What we're expecting to have this year is maybe to file for a project between Mexico and Cuba, the same type of project that there is with U.S. And then there's a platform that the UN has, that's IW Learn. The project has a website now, but it would have the information between Mexico and U.S., monitoring of all the Gulf of Mexico, condition, hard to algal blooms, condition reports, and the idea is to have the same thing with Cuba. So we really have to think of how they would, because we cannot open again the strategic action program between Mexico and U.S., because also the condition of the negotiations between Mexico and U.S. are very shaky. What we agree with the Cuban government is that they would take whatever we have done in this strategic action program, and they would comply with that. So what we think maybe in 4 or 6 years is to have a database between the two of them. That would be something, yes, and accessible to everyone. Because there are public funds from the UN, United Nations, so everything has to be public and accessible. Would be a good negotiation.
Yeah, currently the results that have come from collaborations have produced many different types of publications, but not the actual databases that you're describing. So that's a future goal.
But what we have is the video that you show, the Twilight Zone, it's in YouTube. You can look for it. YouTube? Yes. Yes. And it's called Twilight Zone. Something.
Okay, we're out of time. Stay tuned. Let's hope there will be some good stories to tell about this going forward. Thank you, Lisa.